Alright, so the plan for the stream is a quick, or as it would be with me, as quick as I tend to be, video on the topic of the Gungnir, the epic machine gun that came out with the Polar Lights Battle Pass. So there's been a few different threads I've seen discussing how the Gungnir works, or how people think it works, and I am going to throw my hat in the ring as well and say I feel like I have a pretty solid understanding of how the perk works, and thus this video is my attempt to clarify not only what that is, but some of the nuances that result because of that. So the reason why the video is being made today rather than beforehand, even though we did have access to some of the weapons and modules via people buying levels as soon as they were available and putting builds up on the exhibition, they didn't have quite the ability to swap out parts or using the parts that I was actually particularly interested in for this video. So as a result of it being the weekly reset for Battle Pass challenges today, this is the first day that somebody who bought the Battle Pass and has completed all challenges up to the date could be granted access a Gungnir without purchasing one themselves or otherwise buying levels for the Battle Pass. So the topic of discussion, of course, being focused on the perk itself. It specifies that as the weapon heats up, its rate of fire and spread reduce up to 16% and 80% accordingly. So, of course, we do have a couple of benefits with the pre-upgraded version, which is giving a increased time to overheating and decreased spread out the gate. But I believe I actually picked one up off the market, so I can also compare those. So the background for this, for people who aren't aware, is that the machine guns do have honestly probably the largest variety of weapons at this point in time, which also means that we have a very wide variety of weapon perks and thus how they interact. So the particularly interesting ones, at least to me, and how they possibly could be interpreted with this new weapon. I'm just going to go from left to right here. So looking at the Defender line, the special and epic variants give increased damage resistance for a short period of time as you hit the enemy. The Vindicator, however, is interesting to me, at least because it doesn't require hits. So its perk is slightly different, just saying as the weapon heats up, its damage resistance increases. So this is one that I don't actually have a copy of the weapon, so I'm unable to make my own custom run with it, but luckily the weapon's been around long enough, it should be relatively easy to show how that perk actually works. So if we go to the exhibition, I'll run nearly any vehicle. We can see pretty straightforward with the perk. As you shoot, the damage resistance goes up. As it cools, it goes down. So that's to say that the description is saying that at whatever tier your overheating is at, that's the amount of damage resistance you get. And of course, if you hit the max and it overheats, it's at 40%. So, pretty straightforward. Honestly, probably the most straightforward of the options so far. So, we can actually show a couple of nuances with it, with the favorite, which is a part, not a tag. Because the favorites perk is quite interesting. I'll pick maybe another build that isn't running 4 different weaponry. This is still running 3 different ones. Does not look like the exhibition has a whole lot of people running a set of Vindicators with the favorite, which is unfortunate because it would have made my job here a lot more easily. Displayed. That's fine. Well, I guess these all suck, so we'll just go with one of the earlier ones. So the favorite cabin is also very interesting, has been a very popular choice for machine guns for a very long time. So it is a perk that is activated after charging. Some will have a time restraint, most have a distance component that needs to be met in order to activate. So that's what it is with the favorite. So when it's activated, it stops the weapons from heating up, and then they have a little bit of a dynamic nuance to it as well, which is the slower the weapon heats up, the longer the bonus will last. So that was just done as a way to nerf the use of shotguns with it. Not particularly important to our discussion today, because I'm not necessarily talking about maximizing the favorite so much as the Gungnir, which of course we'll get to after establishing the favorite and the other weapons. So of course when I shoot regularly, if I purposefully miss, you can see the only perk that charges up is the Vindicators. And then of course when we overheat, it prevents me from firing again and it resets to 0. So the interesting thing with the favorite is it actually prevents overheating. So if I trigger it and fire the gun at the same time, you'll note that while I'm firing, the Vindicator doesn't actually gain its perk at all, because the perk prevents overheating from occurring. Likewise, if I am maintaining a level and then activate the perk, oops, poor example there. So I have the Vindicator perk up and I drive forward to, oh, doing a terrible job here of timing this. I'm trying to activate the favorite perk while there's already an amount of overheating on the Vindicator without actually overheating it, which of course is proven very difficult, but there we go. So as I'm firing, the amount of overheat doesn't decrease, which means that doesn't increase, which means that while my weapons do not overheat, perks that are based off of the percentage of overheating will also not apply. Interesting to note, I thought it was maybe another way at one point, but I suppose it makes sense that maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just my misinterpretation of the perk to begin with. But I'd been under the impression that it had sort of frozen the amount of overheat a weapon had when the favorite activates it, but that's actually not the case. It, instead, I assume internally, it just sets the overheat amount of a weapon per shot fired to 0. But effectively what that means is while a weapon cannot directly gain heat as a result of shooting, it can lose overheating. So for instance, if I charge up our perk again, and of course it's still fluctuating based on the amount that the Vindicator is overheated, if I drive forward so that I have the favorite perk and I activate that and stop firing, the amount of the perk still goes down even though shooting does not go up. So that's primarily, I suppose you could say, to the benefit of the player, where as long as you are continuing to shoot, any amount based off of the amount overheated will maintain. But it also means that you can't use it to freeze a certain value of overheat. So I can't stay at, say, 40% without continuing to fire, but of course increased damage output is generally preferable. So there's a couple instances where you wouldn't want that, which are very niche, which is to say if you were, say, cloaking and trying to maintain the overheat, the damage resistance, that wouldn't be as important though in theory, because normally if you're cloaking you don't particularly care to shoot anyway. If you get shot while you're cloaked, unless you're using the beholder cabin, you're going to become uncloaked anyway, and of course the favorite is a cabin, so you can't have both the favorite and beholder perk active at once. And it's possible if you were to, say, prevent or try and prevent somebody from activating their co-driver, such as Grizzly, which is a effect on damage taken, or the Ermac, which is another perk which affects when you hit the cabin, you might not want to deal damage to them at a certain instance in time, but you might also not want to lose the bonus on your weapon for overheats. In that case, you'd have to purposefully miss, because of course if we were to activate the favorite under those circumstances, and you were to not continue firing, you would lose the heat on the weapon, and thus you would be unable to keep the bonus on the Vindicator or other similar weapons, which is to also say it's extremely frustrating, as probably shown by my first couple attempts with getting the favorite and Vindicator perk to activate at the same time, that if you manage to overheat directly before or as you activate the favorites perk with the weapon, you spend that entire cycle with the weapon just effectively cooling down. Of course, the amount depends on the cooling speed of the weapon, but you'll spend a significant portion of it losing overheat on your weapon as you're unable to fire as a result of it being overheated. Oh, thank you, very kind. And not only then would you lose the perk, but then in this instance, if we wanted the perk up, then while that perk is active, again, you wouldn't be able to gain overheat and get steps back. On the plus side, you'd still be able to, of course, deal damage once you're done overheating, but again, if we're strictly talking about the perk, it can be somewhat disadvantageous in that regard. But of course, the advantage being that if you are able to time it properly and you are able to activate it when you are, say, in the top 5%, so 35 to 40% of the weapon's overheating, then being able to maintain it for another few seconds without having to worry about tap firing and not losing the damage resistance bonus is pretty handy. So favorite is really great for any sort of overheat economy thing, and that's why you see a lot of use of it with like close to mid-range overheating weapons. So another one that overheating applies to quite a bit is the aspect. So this is the exact opposite of the Vindicator insofar as at higher temperatures, at higher amounts of overheating, the damage is increased. So just picking any weapon here, we can see it is the second machine gun on the list, whereas my overheating goes up, so too does the damage bonus, which is sitting at about 50% currently. As it cools down, of course I lose that damage bonus. So we can again look at the synergy with the favorite. It'd be really neat if people had singular weapons rather than all these blends, but I guess I am not in the majority of people who have tried out these weapons and deciding that they would be good alongside a favorite cabin. There we go. Excellent, 3 aspects. So this should demonstrate pretty clearly. Same thing as the Vindicator, but instead of having a damage resistance bonus, it's of course a damage bonus. So if I am to activate the favorite while I have a rather high amount of overheating, I am able to maintain that 57% damage bonus for a longer period of time without having to go back to tap firing, without worrying of overheating or doing a full cycle where I purposefully overheat or maybe wait for it to get rather high and then restart it so I can do longer bursts. Consequently, it also has the same disadvantage, which is to say if I time it poorly and I use it while the weapon has overheated and is cooling down, or maybe just activate it and then mistime my burst and I go back down to 0 overheat, I can activate it, continue firing, but I won't be getting the damage bonus at all until after that period of time ends, which of course could be rather disadvantageous depending on what you're doing. And of course, if I let go, it will still cool during the favorite perk period, and I will lose that heat anyway. So, the other option for heat-based, or sorry, I guess rather effects for miniguns as a result of firing, other than the damage dealt hitting a target, which I think is easy enough understood at this point, is to look at one that increases an effect as a result of firing for a period of time. So that is what the minigun line of weapons does. So you can actually see, even though it's classified as a machine gun in the category, it's actually subclassed as a minigun as opposed to these other ones which are all machine guns, or frontal machine gun in the case of the defender line and the tacklies. So, well, and to be fair, the autonomous weapon, the machine gun. But in any case, I digress. The minigun line has 2 options, the light and the heavy, so you can see a difference in the icon. For the sake of the Equalizer and Miller, interesting enough, they don't actually have one for the Reaper the icon's the same. Maybe they'll change that in the future. But in any case, this line, the Equalizer and Arbiter, are referred to, at least internally, at least during the patch updates a couple of times, as the light machine gun line, as opposed to the Miller and Reaper, which are the heavy machine gun line. I don't know to what degree they're actually going to stick with those definitions, especially because they're not even written in-game currently, but in case, good way to differentiate them. We don't actually care about the heavy machine guns at the moment, heavy miniguns at the moment. The Miller's perk is effectively the same as the Guardian or Protector, except it's a effect on X amount of hits rather than doing something on every hit, and the Reaper doesn't have a firing based perk at all, because its perk is that it does not overheat. So for the sake of the light miniguns, the Equalizer and the Arbiter, their perk is the same with higher damage value given for the Arbiter, which is to say the longer the weapon fires, the higher its damage. So another pretty straightforward one, if rather difficult to get working consistently. So for any amount of time that it maintains firing, the damage on it goes up, which is indicated by the red ring wrapping around the icon. And if I use the favorite to freeze the amount of overheating, this allows me to maintain that damage bonus for a longer period of time without, overheating the weapon and having to restart. As a result, if you start partway through and stop and do that a couple of times, you end up losing damage overall at the top end, just as a result of the perk resetting each time. So I have to keep building up that perk for the damage again whenever I stop firing, which is also pretty annoying if you end up trying to shoot around something, other parts of your build, generally other weapons, because that can also reset the perk. So if you want a bumpy landscape, it can reset the firing time of the weapon, where of course under ideal circumstances you want to have it with a full bar for as long as possible, and that's generally starting at a empty bar and then continuing in one extremely long burst as long as you can for that damage bonus for as long as you can, which is what the favorite is very, very popular for, because of course that's going to extend the amount of time I can continue firing at any given point before I have to have the weapon overheat. Pretty explanatory, self-explanatory as well, I think, by the description. So, I mean, obviously it was popular enough I didn't even have to search up the favorite cabin, and it was still literally the first build listed that used the combination. So very, very popular, even more so when the favorite's perk was to eliminate all heat rather than stopping more overheat from occurring. But obviously I think they changed that, not only for balancing, which meant that, because for instance the miniguns or the Cyclone, which works semi-similarly to it, which has a higher fire rate the longer it fires rather than higher damage, but of course higher fire rate means increased damage per second at the cost of higher spread, at higher overheat per second, etc. But the Cyclone or the miniguns were used with the favorite to a terrible extent, just because if you can always reset your overheat without needing to take a pause or break or let it cool down or whatever, which is what the old favorite accomplished, the weapons never cooled down, which also meant that the perk never stopped, so you could shoot theoretically for the entire match as long as you could keep the favorite perk up. So as for the Gungnir, their discussion has been around not only what its perk actually does, but what the conditions for that are. That's why I'm making the video. So as I understand it and would explain it, which I feel is pretty straightforward with the description, but is obviously not enough so for everybody to be on the same page. Whether everybody's right or wrong doesn't really matter. Everybody has very different opinions of how to interpret this. So my interpretation of it has been, and I will continue to explain it as so based off of the testing here, is that while you have the weapon overheating, very much like the Vindicator or the Aspect, the first two examples, the amount of overheat is going to directly influence its perk. so not time-based, which would be the other alternative option. And the effects are that it's going to become more accurate, but it's also going to slow its rate of fire, which is to say that one at maximum overheat without, actually overheating. So that very last shot before you overheat is going to have 80% reduced spread. Of course, whatever other concerns there are with, movement or aiming or whatever, which will of course detract that bonus. But it will have 80% reduced spread, but also have 16% reduced rate of fire, which is to say it becomes more accurate, but you lose damage per second in theory, because the rate of fire between shots, or the rate of fire rather, is decreased, the length of time between shots is increased, so you get less damage in the same amount of time. So we're going to talk about the actual effects of it first before going on to talking about the triggering, just so that it's very clear what that actually does. So like I said, once they allowed you to buy levels, very quickly there was a smattering of builds placed up that showed what it does. And hilariously, again, people use stuff with the Hadron cap, even though reloading time doesn't apply to overheat weapons, but whatever. So see, excellent one with 3 Gungnirs. So we can display, oops, if I actually select to test it. So we can see, and of course the more zoom you have, the easier it is as the reticle gets larger on your screen relatively, but we can see even here as I shoot, unlike most weapons, specifically MGs, where the spread increases as you continue firing, it's actually going to decrease. You can also hear, depending on how much you're paying attention to it, and of course your own abilities, that it does decrease the rate of fire. I don't know the approximate values, I'm not going to sit here with a metronome, but you can hear the shots more rapidly to begin with. And then slowing down and having a rather slower rate there at the end. And mind, it's only a 16% decrease in rate of fire for an 80% decrease in spread. So a pretty good trade-off if you're to ask me, just on the surface, because in theory, if you are, say, twice as good at hitting your target, be it a specific weapon, be it a specific module between armor, hitting them at all, depending on how far away they are and how fast they're moving and how accurate you are. If you're to increase that significantly, which an 80% decrease in spread is sure to do in my eyes, and you take a small loss in damage per second as a result of that, I think that's a rather reasonable trade-off, especially because having increased accuracy, of course, if we look at that, I believe the vehicle there is about 150 meters away from the firing line, which is this white line here. So we can see that the target fits rather nicely in it. Let's see if there's maybe a better example. Probably just use the icebox cabin there at the 200 meter mark. So we can see that I can fit it within the reticle quite well, but there are still some shots that are going to go wide as I continue firing. Pretty much every shot is going to directly hit the cabin, and of course too, with how tight it gets, you could probably pick out specific modules depending on the distance range, if you have other factors decreasing spread such as the Torero cabin, if you have fusions for minus spread, etc, etc. But you do get a significant amount more accurate with the weapon over time, which is pretty good if you're shooting at far distances. And then of course if you lose a small bit of damage for shooting at somebody who's say 200, 300 meters away, unless they're also counter sniping you, it's probably not too big a deal that you're dealing 16% less damage if you are, indeed able to consistently hit more shots. And of course targets being moving and being what they are, it's not necessarily going to be, linear, but you can also see even just aiming directly at the targets, it becomes a lot easier as I get significantly decreased spread. And of course, I'm sure this is better on mouse and keyboard too, where you can get more precise movements in line with the saccades. So, pretty straightforward there. I mean, there's also the other consideration of the Huginn cabin and whatnot, but that's just related to cooling down, so I'm not terribly relevant to the discussion here, I don't think, especially because the Huginn is also, I think, fairly straightforward, but I will maybe touch on that. I guess I could just touch on that later on in the video and just discuss how those work. In any case, the function I think is rather straightforward. You continue firing, you get more narrow spread. So going back to the cabin, which the effect is that it prevents the weapon from heating up further, has, again, a little bit of play in my eyes, at least, with the weapon's functionality. So regarding how it actually works, like I said, there are a couple of different options. It could be based off of the amount of time you fired, which is to say every time you restart a burst, it resets the bonuses, which is in line with the minigun line, the Equalizer line. Or it could work like the other ones I mentioned, where it's based off of the amount of heat that it has, which is the Aspect and Vindicator. So I personally am still maintaining that that is the case. So to prove it, or rather show how I came to those conclusions, or supporting evidence, it's possible I'm still wrong, of course. It's possible they'll change things in the future. It's possible that it's working in a way they didn't intend or expect currently. But in any case, I think the most straightforward way to do that is to show what it looks like at different levels of overheating when we can effectively pause that overheating. So to begin with, I'm going to show that I do have the Bigfoot wheels on, so this reduces distance requirements for perks, which is directly relevant to the favorite cabin. I'm also having the hot red on currently, but I can even use the Cheetah engine, which allows module reset at certain amount of distance past getting reset. Bigfoot and Cheetah synergize very well. Bigfoot and Favorite synergize very well, so putting all three together is generally quite good, but for the purposes of this and to reduce clutter, I'll just leave the hot red on. So in theory, of course, if you want to have as frequent of perk activation as possible with your weapons, it's probably better to be looking at using the highest speed engine available, but of course those are going to have drawbacks insofar as the energy drain primarily, and then you might also need to work around the perks. So a little side note, interestingly, while the Cheetah has a base cabin speed bonus of 20%, the Oppressor originally had a, well, I say originally, but a few updates ago had a max cabin speed bonus of, I believe, around 18%, and they've actually bumped it up to 20% to try and make up for the decreased perk effect, because it used to go up to 100% at 80 kph, now it's 70%. So as a result, you could actually probably use the Oppressor engine now in place of the Cheetah for the literally identical amount of speed given, and a perk that might be more relevant to the weapons that you'd use with the favorite. But in any case, the Oppressor used to have a lower percentile for the cabin speed bonus. As a result, I fused my Cheetah for it, so it's probably the one I'd go for if I was absolutely trying to max the speed of the build, get the vehicle moving as fast as far as possible, and thus charging the favorite's perk as frequently as possible. But especially if you have them unfused, you could certainly use the Oppressor to a large degree of success, especially because you see a lot of point KTM sloped builds where you have wide a wide field of view with each weapon. Being able to effectively drive circles around people is going to require you to be constantly shifting aim, and of course having increased aim speed is going to be excellent. But that's just sort of a side note, not relevant to really what we're discussing here right now. So I'm going to be using a single Gungnir with the cabin, the hot red increased speed, and the Bigfoot's perk, just buffing that so I can get it up more frequently, but not really anything else affecting overheat or speedy, or overheat or cool down, which should make it pretty blatant. So for instance, without using the perk, we can see the spread change and the rate of fire change a lot easier with a smaller total pool, thus more overheat per shot, thus a larger percentile difference. I will also turn the co-driver off so that that's not a potential factor. And then we can test with and without the overheat in effect. So I think probably the best thing I can do is show, and this will also make the rate of fire changes I think a little bit more obvious, because our damage does not scale with the amount of overheat, but our rate of fire, and thus our damage per second, does scale. I can freeze the overheat amount of the weapon and fire at the orb and see how much damage we do in the approximate time that the favorite's perk lasts. So it's going to be kind of hard to line it up. Of course, the perk is going to last for a constant amount of time, but my timing of it will be a little bit off. But I think it should be obvious enough. We'll see from the the reaction time of me stopping firing once the perk is done. We'll see the damage difference between them, the total damage difference in an X period of time, which is going to be the length of the favorite cabin, and thus a decrease in damage over that period of time is going to be as a result of decreased damage per second, which in our case is going to be achieved by the perk, which reduces the rate of fire. So if I activate both these on the same time, I think I can probably do it on the same trigger, so there's no reaction time required for at least starting the perk. And I will get up nice and close so there's no risk of damage drop off. And you can see I deal 345 damage. And then if we get the overheat on this quite high, so we have a significant amount of rate of fire reduction, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drive forward, and it should have enough time for me to activate the favorite without the heat totally dissipating, and then I'll just be aiming at the orb again, and we can compare those damage values. So we can see a not insignificant decrease in the damage. I mean, overall, like I said, especially for the other benefits, maybe not as bad, but it would be kind of hard for me to show it perfectly. So I'll do another one just to show that we should be getting literally identical values. Maybe I'll shoot over to this side so there's less risk of me hitting it by accident. Yeah, identical values, and again, significantly lower than the other. Well, maybe not significant to say, 50 damage out of 350, but at least noticeable. So that shows that we can, use the cabin in that regard. So as far as comparing it to if it had a amount over time, it's actually kind of shown with that first test as well, where if we are going to have the weapon firing, of course it decreases its spread and its rate of fire over time. What that should also mean, if it were time-based, is that using the favorite cabin should not affect the change of the perk, but that does seem to be the case. So if I am shooting, it's of course reducing, and then resetting, reducing, resetting as I lose heat. And if I activate the cabin, which prevents further overheat gain, and continue firing, my spread does not decrease until I run out of the perk. So a way to make this a little bit more obvious is to use a higher magnification, which is going to give us a wider relative size of the crosshairs. So we can see too, it should be very clear at this stage how much it decreases per shot as we overheat. So while this doesn't look as tight as it was when we were in the outside view, it's just mostly a matter of perspective. where we can actually see the amount of distance still left between a, you know, crosshair that's perfectly centered and not. And likewise, because it's a rather obvious change, we can see too how if we prevent the weapon from gaining overheat, we also prevent it from narrowing. And then once it can gain overheat again, it quickly tightens up. So likewise, I can set these on different keys. It's a little bit easier to time it this way than having them on the same one and trying to activate the perk while in transit. So I can get a bit of overheat. I suppose I'll go to the same line I was at just for the sake of consistency. And if I fire for a bit, tighten up the crosshair. Not let it overheat, and then activate the perk, we can see that it maintains that amount of spread and it maintains that rate of fire. Again, changing once the perk is gone, so you can effectively tap fire and keep it at the same degree that it was beforehand. You can let it cool to get an increased rate of fire with decreased spread, or of course you could just keep firing until it overheats for the minimum amount of spread at distance, which is a lot more obviously not really that tight of a spread at this range compared to some of the other weapons, but of course for a machine gun especially, their whole thing being they shoot fast. Pretty decent spread compared to its competitors. So, like I said, I think I have a Gungnir as well, a regular one. Can put that on and we can kind of compare the spreads of them. So I'll do that by isolating them so that their crosshairs shouldn't converge as much as by default, though they're still on the same key. Okay, yeah, see, so they do converge currently. If I maybe put something in front of their barrel from aiming down as much. Alright, it's going to prevent me from... I'm at the same height, right? Yeah, okay, excellent. So, no, again, it's not actually preventing them from converging totally. Okay, well I do want two distinct crosshairs for the purposes of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to widen these until such a time as they are not pointing at exactly the same place, so that we can actually see the difference in spread between the fused and unfused one. Hoping that will be enough, but we might need more space between them. The reason I'm doing this is because otherwise it will average the amount of spread of the weapons, and of course since there's an upper threshold for that, it can get kind of confusing or misrepresentative of how each performs. So hopefully this will make it a little bit more obvious. I'm gonna pull these back again and then put something in front of the barrel. Prevent gun depression. It's still not playing nice. Curse these weapons. I think I might actually be thinking about a different weapon class that allows you to separate crosshairs, because very obviously the one on the left is not even able to shoot the direction I'm looking at right now. And yet it still doesn't show two distinct crosshairs like it would with something like auto cannons. So I don't actually know if I can show what I want to show with it. That's unfortunate. Well, in any case, it was just going to be an example of the sort of extreme ends of the spectrum, which is to say how accurate they are compared to one another with and without the fusion. But I think that's fine too. So what does this mean, this combination? Now, not to say that this is necessarily the best combination out there, or that this is going to become meta or anything, you know, as outlandish or extreme as that, but effectively that you can use the favorite cabin to sort of manage the perk in a couple of different ways. So because we're operating on the understanding based off of those examples that as it increases in overheat, it decreases in its rate of fire and spread, that you can effectively use the favorite to pause that perk at a specific level that you want. So for instance, if I were to be throwing those on different buttons again for one. If I were wanting to optimize the decreased spread of the weapon at far distance, without having to worry about tap firing or the overheating and thus it cooling down, I can achieve that by merely popping the favorite once it's at a spread level I desire. So for instance, right there near the end, I can continue shooting it for quite a while with that decreased spread without risk of overheating or accidentally timing anything. So that's sort of the obvious example I can think of with it. Now, there's actually another nuance which sort of ties into a third dynamic, one dependent on your interests, and that's to say, while it does decrease spread at the far distance, it does also decrease our rate of fire and thus our DPS. So in theory, on the opposite side, if you weren't worried about having a crazy high spread and you were wanting to optimize the rate of fire of the weapons, you'd actually want to keep the heating low, and you can likewise use the favorite at a low heat level to maintain that higher rate of fire at, of course, the cost of no spread decrease. If you're in close range, it's probably not too terribly important that you have a really tight crosshair, so this does allow you to use the cabin to essentially adapt at what degree of the perk you want it to pause for a period of time. So likewise, if you are at a range where you feel it's a comfortable amount of spread without a significant decrease in a loss of rate of fire. And of course, like I said, personally, I feel like the trade-off is maybe a little bit extremely slanted in its favor. Currently, I don't feel like a 16% decrease in rate of fire is a significant downside to the amount of spread decrease you get, but maybe it gets nerfed, maybe it gets changed, maybe it turns out that in battle it is actually fairly significant. I don't know the case, but you could pick, say, any number of halfway points and likewise pause it there, where you can sort of choose at what trade-off you want to have. So, like I said, I think that that's rather interesting with the weapon. Gives you a couple of different options. Likewise, well, not as extreme as, of course, pausing it. You can increase the rate of cooling, you can decrease the rate of overheating. What this does is it's going to give you a longer amount of time before an overheat with the radiator, which means that the spread will decrease more gradually, which makes it easier to fine-tune if you want a specific spread amount or rate of fire decrease. And it also means that if you do end up accidentally overheating it, or if you were to, say, be shooting at somebody far away and then need to engage against somebody right beside you, lower the heat faster so that you can use it at the decreased, I guess, increased rate of fire and increased spread. So as far as testing it, as you know, how it would perform with it being time-based, that's another idea. Personally, I'm okay with it as it is, as an idea. It's pretty interesting, of course, because in most instances, especially as weapons overheat, they become less accurate as a result of the barrel expanding due to heat. So it makes sense that generally the more you fire, the more the spread is. Of course, that's amplified by movement or impulse from other projectiles. That's generally how it performs, to my understanding, in the real world and in most other games. So it's certainly interesting to sort of spin it on its head and say, okay, well, it won't decrease in accuracy. It will actually increase in accuracy, but it will slow down. I don't know how well that translates to IRL. Of course, that's not necessarily the standard that we'd apply to everything in the game, but I think it'd be interesting if instead of having a spread decrease, it maybe started with less spread to begin with, and then instead of having a decreased spread as you continue firing, just merely have it have a continual amount of spread but a decreased rate, with the logic being that it's shooting but it's adjusting its firing rate so that the barrel doesn't expand enough so that you lose accuracy. Again, this is just me making suggestions. It's extremely likely they already had that idea, and maybe that's how the perk originally started, and they decided against it for any number of reasons for gameplay purposes. But just, like I said, maybe a interesting way that they could look at adjusting it or introducing another weapon in the future. So that, I think, is a pretty comprehensive look at the 45-minute comprehensive look at not only the Gungnir, but the favorite cabin and how the two can interact. I think for the sake of it already being a fairly long video, and me already having some of these tangential ramblings, I will also just discuss the Huginn. I did make a post about it on the Reddit, so I will pull that up. In regard to the new Epic Medium cabin, Epic Heavy cabin, contrary to my desires, where the cabin is plus cooling speed and not cooling time. So, very straightforward, in my eyes at least. The Huginn cabin, which I don't actually have yet, because that's actually further levels in the Battle Pass, but there is a plethora of ones available on the exhibition, so I think it'll be straightforward enough to exemplify. The perks description is a little bit more obfuscated, I think. Maybe it's straightforward enough to understand as you know what it means, but for a first-time reader it might not entirely be clear. So basically it's saying when a weapon overheats, you gain a charge that says that it will reduce the cooling time of all weapons. So in theory, at 3 charges, it will reduce the cooling time of all weapons by 105%, which is to say that if you had 5 seconds of 5 seconds of cooling time, having a 105% reduction would actually be negative. It would take negative 0.05 seconds, which is to say it would be effectively instant cooling. Now, while we do actually have a faction vehicle which runs it, which is not that one, I don't think, because that's running the Nothung. Well, I guess we could sort of show it. Maybe we'll just stick with the Gungnir for the sake of making it a little bit more consistent. In fact, I guess we already had the vehicle example showing it. So if you have it, weapon overheat, oh, you're running seals, I don't want that. I want you to be running, oh, so many different vehicles up now. A lot easier when there's only the, like, 3 or 4. Shame. Okay. Well, we can look at the default overheat and cooling time of this. Of course, rather fast without any supporting modules. And then a rather long cooldown. If we use... No, I think it will actually be better to use the Nothungs as an example, since they already have one with multiple sugars here. So, if we just look at the Nothungs, their perk not being terribly relevant, but you'll still see it charge up, of course. If we can find an example with minimal radiators. Excellent. So this increases the amount of... Oh, no, that's not what I want. Yeah, this would have been a lot easier if I just waited until I had a Nothung. To, again, show just literally very stripped down without any modules comparison. But if we look at the cooling time of the weapon, let's say non-Huginn cabin. Realizing, of course, there's a Gungnir here, so you're going to have to ignore that perk. Now, this is with a single shiver, so it's not actually without perks either, without a cooler either, but we can see about 2.5 seconds for them, which is the first and third machine gun icon, so the second and fourth icon overall, to cool down. Again, it's going to be difficult to find an example that doesn't run seals and shivers, but for instance, if we look at using the Huginn cabin, this is going to be an example without any default coolers, or sorry, any hardware coolers. This is using the cabin as a cooler, and that's actually how it performs. So it's going to reduce the cooldown time by the same amount as the shiver, but the effect isn't actually reducing cooldown time, because of course if that were the case, if we had 3 weapons overheat, 3 charges on it, then it would be instant cooldown, and that is not the case, which we can actually see with the faction vehicle. So this is it with multiple shivers, no overheat protection, and the Huginn. So all of these effects of, in the cabin's case, supposedly reducing the cooling time, and then the shivers, which is going to increase the cooling rate. So if we look at this, it has 2 default coolers. I have a fused one, but we can see the values without it being fused or upgraded. So that's 85% increased cooling rate, 85% cooling rate again, so 170% decreased cooling, or sorry, increased cooling rate, and then we have the cabin's perk. So if it were functioning as a reduction of cooling time, again, it would be instant with the 3 weapons, and when this first came out as a faction vehicle, it pretty much looked like it. Like, I don't know if I'd necessarily say it's an instant cooldown, but it's pretty dang fast. So it's hard to say for sure whether or not the cabin is decreasing the time to 0 or increasing the cooling rate. But the thing is, if it did make the cooldown infinitely quick, we wouldn't need the coolers at all, because we'd already have instant cooling. So that's why I thought this was interesting, and that's actually what is accomplished. Example on the exhibition, when we have all of these different coolers, you can see that it actually decreases faster again. So all of these effects are stacking additively, which does mean that there's sort of an opportunity cost to it if that's all you spend your energy on is the shivers. You're effectively getting a 4th shivers effect out of the cabin, because we could see it was adding to the cooldown rate rather than decreasing the cooldown time, as its description says, and that's why I made the thread. So what this means is it's taking the function of another shiver effectively. So it has a 35% decreased, increased cooling rate times 3, so 105% increased cooling rate. The shivers, when fused, are 103% by default, and then you can get another 45% from being stationary, which is pretty much to say that the Huginn's perk seems to effectively be saying, if you have 3 weapons overheat at the same time, you will have a quote-unquote free shivers worth of increase in the cooling rate, so decrease in the cooling time, assuming that you had a fused shiver without the perk active, or approximately 1 shiver without being upgraded with the perk active. So what this ends up meaning is basically the Huginn just becomes another shiver, a worse shiver, arguably, if you have upgraded shivers available or if you're moving at low speed, which kind of raises the question of why you'd run it. Now, don't get me wrong, this thing has a phenomenal size compared to most heavies, being especially flat. Volume-wise, it's about par for the course, but that's heavy cabins for you. But very flat, very neat, very cool. Definitely could see this used for a bunch of different art builds. But as a heavy cabin, it loses an energy point, and its perk being here have a shiver with a bunch of conditionals attached kind of begs the question of why would I not just use a lighter medium cabin, use the 1 extra energy of doing so to run a shiver, and then running a cabin perk that actually helped me with something else. So in my eyes, I almost feel, and I've been pretty vocal about this, and it's not really the point of this entire discussion, but I feel like it would be better if it was treated in the same vein as the Beholder, which is to say that its perk performs the function of a module with conditional, the disadvantages of doing so. But in order to be effective at doing that, I feel like it kind of needs to be a lighter medium cabin, because otherwise you not only lose a quote-unquote perk for it functioning as an energy, but you also lose the energy that you'd free up by doing that anyway. Because I don't really see why people would really run the reduced energy for some extra armor just for the sake of quote-unquote saving an energy spent on a shiver, when you can just do the shiver and lose the mass, lose the armor instead, because that doesn't tend to be the main concern from what I've seen. It's generally a damage race, which to say who gimps who first is normally a larger factor, and of course being tankier helps with that. But if we're looking even at these other tonnage and mass values, it's really not too far ahead of most of the other contemporary epics, certainly not much further ahead than some of the legendary medium cabins. So if you were to say, looking at running, even the Beholder is a phenomenal example, you would say, why would I run about 15,000 kilos of mass with 11 energy and a shiver when I can run about 12,000 kilos of mass with 12 energy and an invisibility module, quote-unquote. It doesn't function quite as well as one, but I can still run it and then have the additional effects of its secondary effect. In my eyes, you just have the Huginn be a medium or a light cabin and maintain its perk as is, and that'd be fine, because it doesn't give additional effects to a module if you do equip it like the Beholder does. It doesn't have that secondary effect, which you could say maybe is what is restricting the Huginn from being a legendary, because it doesn't have a twofold effect. It's very straightforward. This effectively is a shiver as the cabin perk. And I think that'd be fine. Likewise, the Munin started off as a heavy cabin and got bumped to a medium cabin, and for its colossal size and the sake of the cabin perk, I honestly really feel like they should just swap them out. Have the now, I'm not saying we necessarily need a 4th heavy legendary cabin, especially when we don't have a whole lot of lights compared to how many other light cabins we have, but I feel like the Munin would serve better as a heavy cabin as originally intended, the Huginn would serve better as a medium cabin, and then it would have that perk of basically, hey, bring as much energy as you want. Oh, and you can save an energy by not needing to bring a shiver, but still getting that cooldown potential. So this is something I've typed quite a few times. Now this is something I have in video that's kind of tacked on to the other conversation. But yeah, as a result of it being cooling time versus cooling speed, and the result of the Gungnir being based off of overheat percentage rather than overheat time, I don't really see the value of them working together so terribly well. The Nothung a little bit more, because it wants to be cooled down as much as possible whenever you overheat, so that you can get that damage bonus out faster, and theoretically you might not want to spec into radiators at all just for the sake of overheating as fast as possible, getting the damage bonus. But why would it run 11 energy and a shiver when you could just run 12 energy and use a shiver and then have a cabin perk? Because heck, if you look at it, instead of running say 3 Nothungs, and so let's sort of theorize this. If we had the Orca as an example, so we run a 4 energy generator, if we had the Huginn, if we had 3 energy spent on the shivers, so not 1 spent on the engine, we used a hot red instead. So we actually ran what Vile Crab had posted up here. 3 no-thungs, 3 shivers, the Huginn, as much cooling as we could possibly fit on a 3 no-thung build with a heavy cabin. And in fact, all these examples are fused. We overheat as fast as possible, cool down, so we can use the damage orb. We can see about 2,800 damage. I believe I mentioned online that if you actually get the perk up, you can squeeze out a little bit extra damage by having the first 5 be included in that plus 100% damage. Yeah, about 3,000 flat. Then I ask, okay, I could do that, or I could run, and I unfortunately don't think anybody else has put this up yet. I mean, people barely thought to use it with the favorite, so doubt we'll see this. Maybe, actually. Pretty close, Mr. Metal Dog, or Miss Metal Dog, or whatever pronouns you use. But what I was thinking was, instead of running the prior example, why not run the Omni cabin for an additional energy? Gives you 15% increased weapon cooling, and then you run 4 shivers instead of the 3-ish that the Huginn gives you, and then the 3 no-thungs. It seems weird to me, especially with the other perks you could possibly use. The damage bonus of the ghost after being cloaked, because you can activate the no-thungs perk, cloak, come out of cloaking with a significant amount of damage. And I apologize because, again, I don't actually have a full set of the weapons currently, and there isn't currently examples on the exhibition, so I can't actually do the damage comparison tests. But in any case, in most instances, from what I've seen, being a heavy cabin and having the extra mass and mass limit was not the deciding factor of what makes a cabin good for a roll. And that's basically what the Huginn is. It's saying, we're going to take an energy away from you, make you less effective than running 4 shivers, having a cabin perk which could potentially be more cooling just by running the Omnibox, and we're going to kind of make it up to you by making a heavy cabin. It's just I don't really see it. So whether or not I end up being vindicated in the future and the public agrees, or it ends up becoming a meta choice or something, anyway, I do not know. Not clairvoyant, unfortunately, but yeah, I don't see the value of the cabin as it stands, so I guess we'll have to see what the future sort of holds. Hopefully this has been a fairly exhaustive but illuminating look at the new systems introduced with this battle pass, the Huginn and the Gungnir, as well as their synergy with the other systems. So obviously I didn't touch on the Sleipnir, I didn't touch on the Munin, and I didn't really touch on the No-Thung. I mean, a little bit with the example there, comparatively running the Huginn or the Omnibox, but those are things I could possibly explore in the future when I have the parts from the battle pass. And in any case, I figured that this was an easy enough example to do today of showing the Gungnir and the favorite how I believe the perk works, as well as the different options you have on actually utilizing that. So hopefully this has been useful, and like I said, maybe I'll make another video on the topic of other items in the battle pass in the future, but I honestly don't really think that'll be necessary. Most of them are fairly straightforward, and I did kind of outline my complaints with the other items already. If anything, if you were expecting another video, it would probably be looking at using the Sleipnir well as an art build due to their asymmetricality, and making art builds out of the Huginn and Munin cabins. I'll of course have some videos eventually, I'm sure, of me using the Thor generator on builds, but nothing terribly urgent or that I think requires a video calling the items to question. I think most of these others are pretty straightforward, and any sort of content you'd see from me, at least, about them is just using them in a regular or art capacity rather than discussing the minutiae of how the abilities actually